Hi there everyone! Welcome to this week's video where we're going to talk about Locke and Berkeley on primary and secondary qualities. Last week we really investigated in a lot of depth Locke's basic arguments against rationalist epistemology and for his own basic empiricist conception. In short, Locke really seeks to develop a philosophy that can accommodate our common sense beliefs in the reality of external objects and offer a robust philosophical description of what we take to be ordinary cases of perception. We said that Locke's theory involved the thesis that all knowledge comes from sensation and reflection. And while we noted that this excluded the a priori content of innate ideas, we still have not yet really characterized sensation and reflection and the process by which we acquire ideas in enough detail. Today, we're going to remedy that. First, by looking at John Locke's mental representationalist theory of perception. That's a lot of philosophy words that we're going to investigate the meaning of in just a moment. As well as Bishop Berkeley's challenges to Locke's own view and the development of his own idealist variant of empiricism. But let's start out with Locke, okay? So Locke understands the process of sensation to be like this. There's some really existent physical object out there in the world. For the purposes of today's lesson, the example that I've done is a dirty chai from satellite, right? So there's this thing out in the world, and then it is encountered through our sensory perceptual apparatus by an observer of some sort. In this case, I drew a stick figure version of myself. Locke's thought is that what happens whenever I have this sensation of this object is that I begin to develop a complex idea called a mental representation of it. So when we sense things, really what's going on is that we're developing more and more detailed, complex images or mental representations of these objects within our own mind. Now, it's important to point out that the mental representation that I produce has quite a lot of sensory qualities. And some of those qualities belong to the object as it is in itself, and some belong merely to how I am affected by those qualities. So, for example, I regard the dirty chai from satellite as being really yummy and delicious, right? But different people have different tastes, and so it might be the case that someone else would think that the very same object is disgusting, right? In other words, this quality, the quality of being yummy or disgusting, isn't a feature of the object on its own, but it's instead a quality that comes from the interaction between the object and my own sensory perceptual apparatus, right? In this case, taste and smell. So we can identify a whole lot of different qualities of a dirty chai, right, that all go into that complex mental representation that I have in my mind. It's hot, tasty, tall, cylindrical, nutty, gray. It contains 12 ounces of liquid. It's one drink. It's at rest, or it's not in motion, right? And it's a solid, so it's impermeable, right? I can't put my hand through it, as it were, right? And so, what Locke's theory suggests that we ought to do in this case is that we need to go through this mental representation and distinguish those features that we take to be objective features of the object, how it is in itself, and distinguish those from the qualities of the object that pertain to how the object affects my own particular sensory apparatus. What we're going to discover is that it's exactly the sort of features that physics interrogates and investigates, namely size, shape, volume, motion, number, etc., that are going to be real features of that object. And this Locke calls its primary qualities. Whereas the more subjective aspects of these qualities are what Locke calls secondary qualities, right? They are qualities that emerge from the causal relationship between the object in itself and my own senses. So with all of the qualities I just listed, for Locke, being tall, cylindrical, holding 12 ounces of liquid, being at rest, being one, and being impermeable are primary qualities. Those are qualities of the object, how it is before me or anyone else ever perceived it. By contrast, it's being hot, tasty, nutty, and gray. These are all features that belong to the object only insofar as it interacts with my senses of touch, smell, taste, hearing, and sight, right? So that's Locke's mental representationalist theory of perception, right? What we're going to look at now is the way that Bishop Berkeley sought to challenge the nature of Locke's picture in favor of a pretty radical form of idealism. In essence, Berkeley's view of perception goes like this. Take everything that you had in Locke's mental representationalist view, but get rid of all of the primary qualities, right? So Locke says that being tall, cylindrical, and so on are primary qualities of the object. Berkeley is going to argue that all of the qualities that we can say about an object are indeed secondary qualities. In other words, we never see the cup, the dirty chai, as it is in itself. I only have access to my own idea of it. So in essence, to get Berkeley's view, all we need to do is take Locke's view and subtract the first part where Locke says that I perceive a cup out there in reality and form an idea on that basis. The sort of main catchphrase of Berkeley's philosophy is esse est percepi. To be is to be perceived, right? So in other words, Berkeley thinks that everything that we can say about the dirty chai just is those qualities of how it comes to affect our senses. All that exists are thinkers and their representations. Those representations aren't founded in a material thing that actually exists. And it's in this sense that Berkeley, like Leibniz, is an idealist. Berkeley's basic argument is that we don't perceive matter, even on Locke's account. We only perceive the content of our own ideas. And subsequently, we ought to reject the inference that we ever know anything about objects, how they are in themselves. So here are some basic arguments that Berkeley uses to motivate his very unusual view, right? The first is an argument from empiricism, right? The basic argument goes like this. Premise number one: empiricism is the view that we learn or primarily learn from sensation, right? So if we're going to get our our foundational concepts, philosophical concepts from anywhere, they should be from sensation. Premise two: we don't sense matter, right? We don't learn about the nature of matter from sensation. Matter is said to be that which underlies all of the properties that we sense, but we never sense the matter directly. Berkeley thinks even Locke should agree with both premise one and premise two. The conclusion: matter, or the thing about objects that exists independently of perception, is not a genuinely empiricist concept. In other words, if you're going to stick with empiricism, we should just get rid of matter. After all, doesn't matter just seem a lot like the concept of substance as we saw it in the rationalist philosophers? For the same reason that the empiricists stopped talking about substance metaphysics, so too, Berkeley thinks, they should also stop talking about matter. Now let's introduce another argument, right? What we could call Berkeley's argument from secondary qualities. The first premise is, again, something that Berkeley thinks that even Locke should concede to him, namely that secondary qualities are those qualities that concern how our senses are affected, right? Okay, premise two, this is going to be the controversial one, the one where Locke is going to disagree with him. Berkeley argues that all sensory qualities concern how the senses are affected, right? So Locke wanted to appeal to disagreement, for example, to explain the subjective nature of stuff like taste, right? I regard the dirty chai as yummy, but a lot of people will instead regard it as yucky, right? And that has to do with the different ways that the dirty chai affects our sensory perceptual apparatuses. Now, what Berkeley is going to argue is that, in essence, all qualities, including those qualities that Locke called primary qualities, actually concern how our senses are affected, right? So, for example, size, right? Perspective changes the apparent size of objects, right? And so in the same way that taste or smell is variable according to perspective, so too Berkeley is going to argue that even what Locke called primary qualities are relative to perspective. Consequently, correctly understood, they're only secondary qualities. I can't say anything about primary qualities at all. Now, at this point, you might be somewhat impatient with Berkeley's view. I mean, it sounds kind of absurd, right? To be is to be perceived. Does that mean that when you're playing like a game of peekaboo or whatever, right, that things are just like kind of flipping in and out of reality, right? Isn't, Berkeley's theory inconsistent with basic object permanence? Right? That's an objective that we could bring to Berkeley's idealism. Well, here's how he's going to respond to you. He's going to say, you're right, that would be a problem for my theory if there wasn't this great philosophical tool that I have, namely God, right? So his argument goes like this. Premise one, his idealism is true, right? So he's operating from the assumption that his idealism is true, okay? Second, object permanence is real, right? That's what the objector to his view is suggesting, right? Okay, premise three, Per the combination of 1 and 2, if object permanence is real and idealism is true, then it must be that objects are constantly perceived. Even when I'm doing the peekaboo, right, someone is still seeing the objects continuously, right? Otherwise, they would simply cease to exist. Conclusion, of course, there must be a perfect perceiver, someone who perceives everything constantly, perfectly, and that has to be God, right? So Berkeley thinks not only has he dispatched this, kind of objection, to his philosophical system, he also developed an entirely novel conception of God. Now, the debate between Locke and Berkeley really brings out the conflict, or at least potential conflict, between empiricism and natural science. Locke's mental representationalist view of perception is meant to accommodate basic naturalistic scientific insight, right? It's meant to be an explanation for why it is that physics studies ultimate reality, the unchanging, objectively apparent features of objects. Berkeley, though, argues that actually the commitments of the natural scientific view, in particular the commitment to independently existing matter, is actually incompatible with the empiricist worldview. This leaves us with the question, do you think that empiricism is consistent with natural science? Do you think it opposes natural science? If we have to pick one, should we pick empiricism or should we pick natural science? I'm, of course, super interested in hearing what you think, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.